In the vast tapestry of American history, some figures command attention with thunderous speeches and grand public gestures. Their legacies are etched in headlines and monuments. But there are others whose influence is quieter, more profound, a current that runs deep beneath the surface, slowly and irrevocably changing the landscape. Their stories are not about the clamor for power, but about the steadfast exercise of purpose. This is the story of a woman from the sun-scorched plains of Georgia, a daughter of the Great Depression who never sought the spotlight, yet found herself at the very center of global power. A woman whose gentle southern demeanor concealed a will of tempered steel, whose quiet voice championed the silenced, and whose partnership with a peanut farmer from her hometown would not only propel him to the presidency, but would redefine the very meaning of leadership in the modern age. Rosalynn Carter, often called the Steel Magnolia, redefined the First Lady's role, turning it from a ceremonial post into a platform for profound social change, leaving a legacy of compassion that continues to ripple across the world. To understand her journey is to understand the quiet power of conviction, the strength found in partnership, and the revolutionary idea that a life of service is the most meaningful life of all. To truly grasp the world that shaped Eleanor Rosalynn Smith, one must travel back in time, to the heart of rural Georgia in the late 1920s and 30s. Plains was more than a town. It was a universe unto itself, a community bound by the rhythms of the seasons, the shared hardships of the Great Depression, and the unwritten codes of the American South. Life was dictated by the planting and harvesting of cotton and peanuts. The air was thick with the scent of red clay and honeysuckle, and the social fabric was woven from church gatherings, front porch conversations, and a deep-seated sense of mutual reliance. Rosalynn grew up in a make-do-and-mend culture where nothing was wasted and resourcefulness was the highest virtue. This ingrained in her a lifelong pragmatism and an aversion to extravagance that would later surprise the Washington elite. It was a society rigidly segregated by race, a reality that a young Rosalynn would observe with a growing sense of disquiet. It was a place where expectations for women were clearly defined. You were to be a dutiful daughter, a supportive wife, a devoted mother, and a pillar of your local church. Ambitions that strayed beyond these well-trodden paths were often viewed with suspicion. Rosalynn was born into this world on August 18, 1927. Her father, Edgar Smith, was a mechanic and farmer. Her mother, Allie, a talented dressmaker. Their life was modest but stable. From her father, Rosalynn inherited a quiet diligence and a methodical mind. From her mother, she learned resilience and the art of making something beautiful out of limited resources. But this foundation of youthful security was shattered in 1940. When Rosalynn was just 13, her beloved father was diagnosed with incurable leukemia. For months, the family watched as the strongest man she knew slowly faded. His death was the first great tragedy of her life, and it thrust her into adulthood with breathtaking speed. Overnight, the carefree girl vanished. With her mother overwhelmed by grief and the need to provide for 4 children, Rosalynn stepped into the void. She became a second mother to her younger siblings, managed household chores, and helped her mother with her sewing business, working late into the night after completing her schoolwork. This crucible of loss and responsibility forged the core of her character. It instilled in her a profound empathy for those who suffer, an unshakable work ethic, and a fierce protective instinct. She learned in the most painful way possible that life was fragile and that one's duty was to face adversity, not with complaint, but with quiet, determined action. This was the raw material from which the Steel Magnolia would be formed. It was in this small town that her path first crossed with a young, ambitious midshipman from the Naval Academy named Jimmy Carter. He was her best friend, Ruth's older brother, a figure she'd known her whole life but never really seen. One summer day in 1945, Jimmy, home on leave, saw a photograph of Rosalynn and was instantly smitten. He secured a date, and on that first outing, with the characteristic confidence that would define him, he impulsively told her he loved her and wanted to marry her. Rosalynn, just 17 and fiercely independent, was taken aback, even a little annoyed by his forwardness. She was focused on her studies at Georgia Southwestern College, dreaming of a life beyond the confines of plains. But Jimmy was persistent. A courtship conducted largely through letters began, bridging the distance between Plains and Annapolis. In those letters, a deeper connection formed, built on shared values and a surprising intellectual kinship. In 1946, she finally said yes. Their marriage was not just a union of two people. It was the beginning of a partnership that would become one of the most consequential in American history. The early years were a whirlwind, dictated by the demands of the U.S. Navy. They moved from base to base, from Virginia to Hawaii, from Connecticut to California. For Rosalynn, it was an exhilarating, eye-opening experience. She was seeing the world, managing a household on a tight budget, and raising their 3 young sons, Jack, Chip, and Jeff, often alone while Jimmy was away on submarine duty for months at a time. This period honed her independence and self-reliance. Life as a Navy wife, especially a submarine wife, was a unique test of character. It was a life of constant upheaval, of packing and unpacking, of making new friends only to say goodbye a year later. More profoundly, it was a life lived with a constant low-level hum of anxiety. When Jimmy's submarine was out on patrol, he was completely out of contact, submerged beneath the waves for weeks on end. There were no phone calls, no letters. She had to manage everything. The children's illnesses, the household finances, the car breaking down, entirely on her own, with the quiet courage expected of military spouses. It was during these years she learned to build support networks from scratch, forging tight-knit bonds with other Navy wives who understood the unique pressures of their lives. She was not merely a dependent spouse, she was the anchor of their family, the CEO of their domestic life. Then in 1953 came a second seismic shock, mirroring the loss of her own father. Jimmy's father, Earl Carter, died of pancreatic cancer. Jimmy felt an overwhelming duty to return to Plains and take over the family's struggling peanut farm and warehouse. For Rosalynn, the news was devastating. She had built a life for herself outside of Plains, a life of intellectual stimulation and relative anonymity. The thought of returning to the small town she had been so eager to escape, to a life dictated by the fickle fortunes of agriculture, felt like a regression. They had their first major argument, a passionate clash of 2 strong wills. This wasn't a simple disagreement. It was a fundamental conflict over the direction of their lives. She saw a future of expanding horizons while he felt the pull of legacy and duty to the land. She tearfully argued that he was giving up a promising career and forcing her back into a world she had outgrown. But ultimately, her commitment to their partnership prevailed. She agreed to go back, but on her terms. She would not be a silent bystander. She would be a full partner in this new venture. This decision would prove to be her political and business crucible. While Jimmy focused on modernizing the farming techniques, Rosalynn, with her sharp mind for numbers and details, took charge of the warehouse's financial accounts. This was no simple bookkeeping. She immersed herself in the complex world of agricultural commodities, learning about grading standards, market fluctuations, and government regulations. She dealt with tough, skeptical farmers, balanced the books with meticulous precision, and helped transform a heavily indebted operation into a thriving enterprise. It was here, amidst the dust and toil of the peanut business, that she mastered the skills of management, strategy, and negotiation. She was proving to herself and to the world that she was far more than a politician's wife. She was a formidable businesswoman in her own right. This hands-on experience gave her a profound understanding of the economic struggles of rural Americans, an understanding that would deeply inform her future advocacy. The transition from the world of peanuts to the world of politics was a natural, if not entirely planned, evolution. Jimmy Carter's growing frustration with the racial injustice and political corruption he saw in his community spurred him to run for the Georgia State Senate in 1962. It was a notoriously dirty race, marred by ballot stuffing and voter intimidation from the local political machine. When the initial results showed an impossible number of votes for his opponent, it was Rosalynn who encouraged a distraught Jimmy not to give up, but to fight. They challenged the fraudulent election and won. It was their first taste of political battle, and it solidified their resolve. Throughout his time in the state Senate and his subsequent initially unsuccessful run for governor in 1966, Rosalynn became his indispensable strategist and campaigner. The devastating loss in that first gubernatorial race was a turning point. It was then that they both underwent a profound spiritual reawakening, deepening their Christian faith and recommitting themselves to a life of public service. When Jimmy decided to run for governor again in 1970, they were a different kind of team, more focused, more organized, and more determined than ever. Rosalynn's role in that campaign was revolutionary for its time. She was not content to host teas and smile for cameras. She embarked on her own grueling campaign schedule, crisscrossing Georgia's 159 counties, often driving herself from one small town to the next. She would walk into barbershops, beauty parlors, and factory floors, introduce herself, and ask for people's support. She was naturally shy, and public speaking was an ordeal for her. She would practice her speeches relentlessly, her hands trembling, but she forced herself to do it because she believed so deeply in her husband's vision for a new South. She developed a unique and powerful campaign technique. After every event, she would meticulously write down the names of people she met, their concerns, and any promises made. Back at headquarters, she would organize these notes, ensuring that every question was answered and every request was followed up on. She became an intelligence gatherer, a grassroots organizer, and a humanizing force for the campaign, connecting with voters on a deeply personal level. Her quiet competence and genuine interest in people's lives won over thousands of skeptical voters who saw in her not a politician's wife, but a reflection of their own values and struggles. When Jimmy Carter, the long-shot, one-term governor of Georgia, announced his candidacy for President of the United States in 1975, the political establishment in Washington scoffed. He was a complete unknown, but they underestimated the Carter team, and especially they underestimated Rosalynn. The strategy was audacious: to outwork everyone, to compete in every primary, and to build a movement from the ground up. Rosalynn became the campaign's secret weapon. While Jimmy focused on Iowa and New Hampshire, she was dispatched to states across the country, often territories where the Carter name meant nothing. She would fly into a state, rent a car, and with a map and a list of local contacts, begin a relentless schedule of appearances. She spoke to Lions clubs in Florida, met with labor leaders in Ohio, and debated policy with college students in California. She became so adept at campaigning that she was entrusted with entire regions, Her knowledge of the issues was encyclopedic. Reporters who tried to trip her up with obscure policy questions were often stunned by the depth and detail of her answers. She wasn't just repeating her husband's talking points. She had her own nuanced understanding of domestic and foreign affairs. One little-known story from that campaign perfectly illustrates her impact. In the crucial Florida primary, the Carter campaign was struggling to make inroads against the more established George Wallace. Rosalynn spent weeks crisscrossing the state, focusing on the conservative northern panhandle. She met with a small group of influential local leaders who were wary of Carter's progressive stance on civil rights. Instead of delivering a canned speech, she sat with them for 2 hours, listening to their concerns about the economy and federal overreach. She spoke about their shared rural values, her experience in the family business, and her deep Christian faith. She didn't change their minds on every issue, but she earned their respect. Carter went on to win the Florida primary, a victory that propelled him toward the nomination, and many credited Rosalynn's tireless, personal outreach as a key factor. She was, as one campaign aide later remarked, the best politician in the family. On January 20th, 1977, when Jimmy Carter took the oath of office, Rosalynn Carter stepped into a role that had for much of American history been defined by convention and restraint. The First Lady was expected to be a gracious hostess, a fashion icon, and a silent, supportive presence. Rosalynn Carter had no intention of being any of those things. From her very first day in the White House, she signaled a dramatic break with tradition. She saw her position not as a title, but as a job, a platform from which to effect meaningful, lasting change. She established an office in the East Wing staffed with policy advisors and schedulers, and treated it as a professional workspace. She famously attended cabinet meetings, not as a silent observer, but as an active participant. She would sit at the table taking meticulous notes, and while she rarely spoke during the formal proceedings, she would later engage the president in rigorous private discussions, questioning his assumptions, offering alternative perspectives, and serving as a vital sounding board. President Carter openly declared, "Rosalynn is my closest advisor," a statement that both startled and reshaped public perception. This dynamic, sometimes critically dubbed a co-presidency, wasn't just a White House arrangement. It was the culmination of a 30-year partnership forged in the dust of their peanut farm and tested on countless campaign trails. Her influence was perhaps most visible and initially most controversial in the realm of foreign policy. In the spring of 1977, she embarked on a landmark diplomatic mission to 7 Latin American countries. This was no mere goodwill tour. She went as the president's official emissary, tasked with conducting substantive policy discussions on human rights, arms control, and economic development, issues at the very heart of the Carter administration's foreign policy. She prepared for the trip with the intensity of a seasoned diplomat, undergoing weeks of briefings from the State Department and the National Security Council. Her performance on the trip was nothing short of remarkable. In Brazil, then under a military dictatorship, she met with government officials and, in a bold and carefully calculated move, also met with human rights activists and religious leaders who were critical of the regime. She delivered a firm, clear message about the United States' new emphasis on human rights, a message that resonated throughout the hemisphere. She debated complex issues with heads of state, demonstrating a command of detail that earned their respect, however grudging. The trip was a resounding success, establishing her as a serious and credible player on the world stage. It also sent a clear message back home. This First Lady would not be confined to the traditional East Wing. But of all the causes she championed, none was closer to her heart and none would form a more enduring part of her legacy than the fight for mental health. This was not a fashionable or politically safe issue in the 1970s. Mental illness was still deeply stigmatized, a subject of fear and misunderstanding. But Rosalynn had seen its devastating impact on families in her own community and across the country during her campaigns. She saw it as a fundamental issue of human dignity and social justice. As the active honorary chair of the President's Commission on Mental Health, she embarked on a nationwide listening tour. She traveled to cities and towns holding public hearings where she invited ordinary people to share their stories. She listened with profound empathy as parents spoke of their struggles to find care for children with schizophrenia, as veterans described the invisible wounds of war, and as individuals recounted their battles with depression in a society that told them to just snap out of it. These raw, powerful testimonies galvanized her. She was determined to translate this human suffering into concrete policy action. The culmination of this work came in 1979, in a moment of quiet, historic power. Rosalynn Carter became only the second First Lady in history to testify before a committee of the United States Congress. She appeared before a Senate subcommittee to advocate for the passage of the Mental Health Systems Act, the landmark legislation that had grown out of her commission's work. In a room full of seasoned, cynical politicians, she spoke with a moral clarity and personal conviction that was undeniable. She didn't just recite statistics. She told the stories of the people she had met. She argued passionately that mental health care was not a luxury, but an essential component of public health, and that it was a moral imperative for the nation to provide accessible, affordable care for all its citizens. Her testimony was a tour de force, and it was instrumental in securing the passage of the act in 1980. The law was a sweeping reform designed to fund a network of community-based mental health centers across the country. Tragically, much of its funding was repealed by the subsequent administration, a deep disappointment for Carter. But the legislation itself was a watershed moment. It fundamentally changed the national conversation about mental illness, dragging it out of the shadows and into the light of public policy. Rosalynn Carter had used her unique platform to give a voice to millions who had suffered in silence, and in doing so, she ignited a movement that continues to this day. The Carters' time in the White House was a whirlwind of historic achievements and immense challenges. Rosalynn was a quiet but crucial presence during the tense 13-day negotiations of the Camp David Accords, which brokered a historic peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. While the men debated politics, she focused on the human element. The atmosphere at the secluded retreat was incredibly tense. Negotiations frequently stalled, and the tempers of the leaders frayed. Rosalynn took it upon herself to be a calming, humanizing force. She organized informal walks, shared meals, and spent hours talking with Eliza Begin and Jahan Sadat, building bridges of personal trust that existed outside the fraught political discussions. She provided a space for these women to share their anxieties and hopes, which in turn helped to soften the hardened stances of their husbands. President Carter later acknowledged that her ability to maintain a sense of civility and personal connection was essential in keeping the talks from collapsing entirely. She was also a steadfast advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment, lobbying state legislators and using her platform to fight for constitutional equality for women, even when it was politically unpopular. But their presidency was also beset by crises beyond their control, a stagnant economy plagued by inflation, an energy crisis that led to long gas lines, and the Iran hostage crisis, which cast a long, dark shadow over their final year in office. In 1980, Jimmy Carter was defeated in his bid for re-election. Leaving the White House was a painful and disorienting experience. They returned to Plains not as triumphant heroes, but as a former president and first lady who felt their work was unfinished and their vision for the country had been rejected. For most political couples, this would have marked the beginning of a quiet retirement filled with memoir writing and lucrative speaking engagements. But the Carters were not most political couples. For them, service was not a job you retired from. It was a calling. The end of their political career marked the beginning of their greatest chapter. With their boundless energy and a shared belief that they still had much to contribute, they founded the Carter Center in Atlanta in 1982. It was a novel concept, an institution led by a former president dedicated to waging peace, fighting disease, and building hope around the globe. Rosalynn was a co-founder in every sense of the word. She was instrumental in shaping the center's mission, and she took the lead on its mental health program, continuing the work she had started in the White House. She organized annual symposia, bringing together experts, policymakers, and people with lived experience to combat stigma and advocate for better care, not just in the U.S., but worldwide. Her post-presidency work also gave birth to another pioneering initiative, one born directly from her own life experience. Having cared for her dying father as a teenager, and having witnessed the toll that illness took on countless families, she developed a deep appreciation for the unsung heroes of the healthcare system, the caregivers. In 1987, she founded the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers, RCI. She recognized that millions of people, spouses, parents, children, friends, were providing unpaid, round-the-clock care for loved ones, often at great personal cost to their own physical, emotional, and financial well-being. The RCI was created to provide them with support, resources, and a national voice, shining a light on their invisible labor and advocating for policies that would ease their burden. It was a cause that was both deeply personal and universally resonant. Together, she and Jimmy embarked on what has been called the most remarkable post-presidency in American history. They traveled to remote villages in Africa to lead the fight against guinea worm disease, a horrific parasitic infection. This wasn't a mission directed from a comfortable office. They were on the ground, wading through mud, personally demonstrating to villagers how to use water filters. There are powerful accounts of Rosalynn sitting for hours with children afflicted by the agonizing process of removing the worm, offering them comfort and holding their hands. Her quiet empathy in those moments did as much to build trust and ensure the program's success as any high-level policy. Through the Carter Center's tireless efforts, the disease has been reduced from millions of cases a year to a mere handful, putting it on the brink of eradication. They monitored elections in dozens of fragile democracies, from Panama to East Timor, lending their integrity to the cause of free and fair government. And, in one of their most enduring and iconic images, they donned tool belts and hard hats to build homes with Habitat for Humanity, working alongside volunteers and future homeowners, demonstrating that leadership is about service, not status. As the years turned into decades, Rosalynn and Jimmy Carter grew into their roles as beloved global elders, their moral authority and commitment to humanitarianism earning them a respect that had often eluded them in the political arena. Their partnership, always the bedrock of their lives, seemed only to deepen with time. They continued their work well into their 90s, a testament to their extraordinary vitality and unwavering sense of purpose. In May of 2023, the Carter family shared the difficult news that Rosalynn had been diagnosed with dementia. It was a cruel irony for a woman who had dedicated so much of her life to a better understanding of the human mind. Yet even in this final vulnerable chapter, she was surrounded by the love that had sustained her for a lifetime. She spent her last months at home in Plains, in the modest house they had built in 1961, with her beloved Jimmy, who was himself receiving hospice care. The image they shared with the world was one of enduring love and quiet grace in the face of life's ultimate challenge. Rosalynn Carter passed away on November 19, 2023, at the age of 96. She died peacefully at home, with her family by her side. Her legacy is vast and multifaceted. It is the story of a political revolution, a quiet but firm insistence that the First Lady could be a substantive policy partner. It is the story of a social crusade, a relentless effort to bring mental illness out of the darkness and into the realm of public health. It is the story of a humanitarian mission, a post-presidential life lived in service to the world's most vulnerable. But perhaps her most profound legacy is the partnership itself, a 77-year epic of love and shared purpose that functioned as the quiet engine behind their public lives. More than just a marriage, it was a working model that demonstrated to the world how mutual respect could become a powerful world-changing force. Rosalynn Carter's life was a testament to the idea that true strength is not loud, but quiet, that real influence is not wielded, but earned, and that a life dedicated to easing the suffering of others is the most profound legacy one can leave. From the peanut fields of Plains to the halls of power and the far corners of the globe, she walked with a quiet dignity and an unshakable purpose, a steel magnolia whose compassion changed the world.